And we're back with Kevin McNamara. Kevin, this is your first time on the pod. I'm sure a variety of people know who you are listening, but for the listeners who don't know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure thing. First, I want to say thank you to Chris and E3 for having me on. It's been really cool to watch this kind of come about. Thinking back to not all that long ago, we were side by side when you were treating your first patient as a clinician, and to where you guys are at now is really awesome. So thank you for that. And in terms of me, I started out as I guess, intro to the health and human performance world in more of the physical preparation and strength and conditioning side of things. Ultimately made my way towards the clinical or the medical aspect of things through PT school. And now I currently practice at a private sports medicine facility outside of Seattle, Washington, where I get to kind of integrate the best of both worlds. So that's probably where I'll leave it for me.
Nice. The relationship we've had, I've been very fortunate to call you a close friend and mentor. For people that know the OG clinical athlete, Kevin was a part of these journal clubs that you did with Quinn Hennick, who we've had on previously. And I just reached out to you at one point, and I think you were about to start residency, your sports residency. I was about to start PT school. We chatted on the phone. 3+ years later, I'm working in the same clinic as you. And yeah, it was an honor working with you for that 2 years. And we still are very much close friends, and we'll be back in the same state soon enough. So yeah, this is just a selfish way to talk with you more, to get you on the podcast. And your post on Instagram, I would say you're kind of an underground, just like a hidden gem that a lot of people, they're not going to know about Kevin because he doesn't really share much on social media. But you had relatively recent post on kind of these 10 principles of sports performance or sports medicine and performance rehab. And I thought this would be a great time to bring you on selfishly, and then for people to kind of hear a lot of the awesome insights that you have. So this post that you created, we're going to go through all 10 of these kind of principles that you call them. And I think they're just great to elaborate on and hear your perspective and kind of riff off from there. So we'll just dive straight into that first one that you put on human first. You elaborated it in your Instagram post and what that means, but I'd love to hear from you. What does human first mean, and why is it kind of your first principle?
Yeah, I think, I'm certainly not the most prolific consumer of social media, but this kind of just came about to where I didn't really have any intention of necessarily making this into content. It was kind of one of these scenarios where nearing the end of the year, I worked through just sort of a post-mortem, so to speak, of just kind of like professionally, financially, personally, all these type of things. By no means is this kind of me attempting to define how others should practice. I'm more so just sharing what's maybe helped me make better decisions and serve, my athletes, my patients better. It's not a rigid system or rules to be strictly followed. It's more of just kind of a reflection of my thinking. And it's what are maybe like the commonalities that I feel like exist across all sorts of patient interactions, whether we're talking about high level performance athletes or maybe low level persistent pain, whatever that may be. These things seem to be a common thread across them. So the first one, human first, I would just start by saying that athletes and people, they don't experience injuries in an isolated vacuum. You're very much treating a person with an injury, not a person that is attached to, a painful joint or something like that. And I think this is what often adds to the complexity of the rehab process. I think that there's a lot of commonality or crossover between high level rehab and high level performance, but one of the primary differences, in my opinion, comes from these additional layers or pieces that you're kind of simultaneously managing or dealing with in rehab. There are some of these more maybe human or emotive type of factors, whether we're talking about, fear, identity loss, internal and external pressures, timelines, sometimes preconceived beliefs is a very big element in that as well. So I think all of those things make the environment of rehab potentially much more volatile. And what I kind of have reflected on a little bit is if you fail to account for some of those things, you're probably operating on the back foot before you even get the process started, whether you're realizing it or not, or whether you're aware of it or not. And I suppose some of that comes from the fact that my view on things, and this may be, a potentially a controversial opinion or something along those lines, is that we're not really a procedure-driven profession. I think that we're much more of a process-oriented profession. And what I mean by that is we don't, quote unquote, fix people or do things to people. We trying to get people to engage in a process. And by nature, a process is going to involve time. It's going to involve commitment. There's often an element of behavior change that is also at play there. And all of those things are incredibly difficult to secure if you don't have a foundation of trust that's established with the individual first. And I think that trust underpins adherence, and adherence underpins successful outcomes in rehab. So, and I think that the literature supports this as well, because what we're really kind of talking about is this maybe concept or idea of like therapeutic alliance, right? So there's certainly going to be cases in rehab where the details of your rehab and your programming are going to matter a lot. If I've identified specific trainable deficits that I feel like need to be addressed throughout the rehab process to drive a successful outcome, then the details or the specifics of my programming in my rehab are going to matter a lot. And I don't think that that's something that we can really debate. I need to be able to deliver a stimulus to impart a positive change on these things I've identified. But there's also plenty of cases and instances where maybe the nuts and bolts or the specifics of the rehab are maybe less important. And potentially some of these may be more contextual or non-specific effects are maybe a bigger driver of some of our outcomes. And I think that sometimes that's not considered enough. And in reality, that may be the biggest mediator of recovery, or certainly play a bigger role than we realize or give it credit for. So I think wrapping up on this, the point I was trying to maybe get at or make was, before we zoom in, we need to be able to kind of zoom out and prioritize the relationships and the rapport elements, because I think that that's likely to be the biggest driver of success. And it may be like the 50th ACL reconstruction that you've managed this year, or the 10th case of low back pain that you've seen this week, but we can't really lose sight of the fact that for that person, it's oftentimes a very new or novel experience, maybe their first time dealing with pain or injury. And there's going to be a multitude of things that are going on under the surface that have the potential to influence their recovery. And I think it's important that we account for those. And for my kind of personal reflection, I think that there's been cases where I've had athletes or people that I feel like programming and execution, we've been very dialed from the rehab side of things and progress has stalled. And then there's been other scenarios where maybe we've had imperfect execution or imperfect programming, but we were able to continue to progress. And I think that a lot of the differences in those outcomes were probably due to buy-in and trust. So that's kind of where I was attempting to get to with that first one.
I love it. I don't have much to add there, and I know we have quite a few principles to go through, so I'll leave it with all of what you said. The second one, build the process around the athlete. What do you mean by that? What's the purpose? Take it from there.
Yeah, so I think that the difference between what I was kind of getting at there was athlete-centered versus athlete-led is kind of something that I made note to, and the primary difference between those probably goes back to the amount and degree of autonomy. And I think that people will sometimes hear athlete-centered and mistakenly means that the athlete's the one who's calling the shots or something along those lines, which I would consider that much more of maybe an athlete-led process. So in terms of the differences, I suppose the line I draw between the two is that an athlete-centered process is the one where the clinician or the coach is kind of designing the process around the athlete's context, versus an athlete-led process is where the athlete is making decisions or dictates decisions without necessarily as much guidance or something along those lines. So I think it's important to underscore the fact that an athlete-centered process doesn't mean that you are giving up or sacrificing your role. It means you're kind of adapting it the process adapts to their goals, the constraints, the context without abandoning your standards. Like I'm still very much responsible for building the guardrails, doing the decision making, but the plan is being fit around the person in front of you. It still requires your knowledge and your expertise, but there's like a collaborative tint to it. So I think that's maybe like the biggest difference there in terms of an athlete-centered approach versus an athlete-led approach.
Number 3, define the problem, determine your role, and align expectations.
Yeah, this is an important one, I think. And I think that, we all have probably had scenarios where we can kind of relate to what ultimately happens if we don't get these things kind of right. But I mentioned this in the post, and I think that a lot of the friction in the rehab process can often be traced back to maybe a failure to set appropriate expectations or a lack of clarity on roles within the process. Or sometimes it can also be thinking that this conversation took place when maybe it didn't, or it wasn't fleshed out to the extent that it needed to be. So I think that it's important to try to engage in this process as early as you can, while also recognizing that your role as the clinician may change or kind of evolve over time. So like early on, I would say like defining the problem is ultimately going to be trying to figure out or understand like what's the driving force as why they're seeking care in the first place. And I think for a lot of people, depending on the setting you're working in, it may be, pain or something like that. But I do think that if you're strategic and you're good with your kind of questioning and you're kind of maximizing some of the interaction or the dialogue between yourself and the patient, you can often start to peel back the layers and maybe give you something a little bit more to kind of go after. Defining the problems kind of really just based off of that. It's what's limiting their progress. And then clarifying the role is being maybe a bit more specific as to what they are really thinking your job is in this process. That may be something you discover together, but am I simply an educator in this process where I'm maybe reducing fear around a diagnosis that they may have received or something like that? Is this scenario where I'm running all elements of their care and their programming? Are there other stakeholders involved? It's just being very specific with respect to what they're expecting of me during this process, because I think that if you don't have an understanding of that, it's going to be very hard to be successful. And then expectations is just an understanding of what are they expecting to get out of the process? What's their background understanding? Do they have some sort of particular timeline that they're maybe expecting a resolution of symptoms? What do they define as success, and who kind of owns what is what's ultimately important, I think, with that element of things. So ultimately, I think that if you can leave your first interaction or your first few interactions in a position where you and the individual have a shared understanding of what may be going on, who's going to be responsible for what, and what we can expect the process to look like, maybe a rough draft of what that entails, you're likely going to wind up with better outcomes and kind of avoid this aimless clinical drift, which I think we've all experienced. And when I find myself in that position or that scenario, it's usually because I've maybe missed the boat on some of these earlier steps with respect to defining roles, expectations, and things of that nature.
Out of those 3, defining the problem, determining our own role, and then aligning expectations, is there one of those 3 that feels consistently the most challenging, either for yourself or that you would assume, newer clinicians in general struggle with more than the others?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think sometimes defining the problem is challenging because it's very much contingent on that person's kind of like ultimately what's their driving force of seeking care. Perhaps what's maybe difficult about that is, again, it's going to be dependent on the person that's sitting in front of you. But if you do have someone that is very maybe hyper focused on their pain or their symptoms or things like that, it makes it challenging to sometimes discover what else may be problems or limitations around some of that. And I think that it takes a skilled communicator and a skilled clinician to be able to sometimes pull a little bit more out of the patients that may be kind of more in that bucket or category. And I think that's something that is still a challenge for me on a daily basis in clinical practice. It's kind of an ever-evolving thing that I'm trying to get better at. I think that determining your role is often something that can be established in maybe a more consistent or easy manner. And then aligning expectations ultimately is just going to be based off of were you upfront with kind of your questioning and your understanding of your role, their understanding of the role in the process? So I think that probably defining the problem is one that I think is still a bit hit and miss and can be difficult.
Number 4, decisions are shared, responsibility is mutual. What do you mean by that statement?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's a great soundbite, but it definitely requires a little more elaboration. So simply put, I would say that we're just talking about joint decisions and joint ownership. So what shared decision making looks like to me, or I guess the way that I think about it is I'm trying to present options with sufficient context for the person while also doing my best to explain any potential trade-offs and also being as honest as I can about uncertainty, which is going to be kind of baked into the cake with a lot of these things. And from there, the hope is that we can move forward together with both parties kind of operating from maybe a more informed position and choosing a path together, which would be kind of the joint decision side of things, while the joint ownership is moving forward with the understanding that we both have a little bit of skin in the game and are under an obligation to kind of hold up our end of the bargain or the deal. So I'm going to do my best to try and organize the process, guide, and educate. And I expect you to be the one that is going to provide the effort, the consistency, and the honesty necessary for us to be successful. And I think that I've noticed a shift myself clinically when I started to implement this in a little bit more of a deliberate fashion, not just in terms of outcomes, but also just day-to-day cognitive load and like successful interactions. And I think it's a really important thing to try to prioritize in your patient encounters and clinical interactions.
Are you verbally creating this sense of like shared mutual responsibility of like, these are the roles that I have, or this is where I'm going to help us along this path, but ultimately these are the things that are completely in your control or that I expect from you? Are you laying those out so it's this kind of verbally agreed upon standard and responsibility that's set, or is it less so of that true kind of obvious discussion?
Yeah, I think it's probably a mix of both. I don't think it's quite as like black and white as like sign this contract with me. It's a bit more of like kind of like something that probably emerges or evolves as you go through the process. But I do think that it's important that the patient is also aware and understanding that they have some ownership in their care, and like kind of building a little bit of the self-efficacy in the process, I think is important for any number of conditions. But I think it's probably something that is a bit more organic, to where it's maybe done through conversation, much less so of this very like kind of like rigid, I expect you to do X, Y, and Z type of thing. But there are also cases where I think that you can be a bit more upfront with some of those discussions, particularly if you are feeling that there may be a driver of some of the continued problems and the patient maybe have an influence on some of that stuff. So I think it's much more organic. It's probably not quite as black and white. Certainly not as straightforward as a signed contract or something like that. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah,
that's kind of the way I think about it.
What happens when you're putting in all this work as a rehab provider and you're putting in the effort of developing a plan, listening, creating a sense of direction, and there's not that mutual responsibility or effort on their end? Do you have some of those situations where you then have to figure out, how do I give them more skin in the game? Or ultimately, this is their body, this is their decision. How much effort do I put in if they're not giving back the same amount? If that is kind of a question that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I think it's kind of one of the things that we'll chat about towards the end, I think, with being responsible to, but not for. It's a difficult kind of place to find yourself in. So I think that we can kind of expand on this as we go through a little bit more, but I think it starts with kind of returning to the conversation and just trying to find some common ground first, and then having an open interaction and hopefully an open discussion with the person that you're able to kind of express some of the things that you may be, seeing, observing, or feeling, and likewise they feel comfortable enough with you to do the same. I think that's probably going to be the recipe for success to maybe combat some of those challenging situations.
Let's go to number 5. Reverse engineer the plan from the outcome. And you touch on starting from the end and working your way back, essentially. Why is that valuable, and how can clinicians actually go through some of that process?
Yeah, I think that sort of gets at this idea of the ability to think in a forward manner, but also kind of plan in a backwards or reverse manner. And I think it's important for a number of reasons. First of all, I think that it forces you to be intentional with your rehab, and it protects against getting maybe too myopic or too kind of tunnel vision with one specific thing or quality. So in a lot of ways, you can think of it as it's maybe quite conducive to like the implementation of a vertical integration model during rehab, where you're attempting to kind of build or layer multiple qualities or multiple things in this kind of almost simultaneous or parallel fashion. I also think it goes a really long way in creating vision for the person or the athlete in front of you, which is super, super important. If I'm coming into a rehab where I've never been through anything like this before, I've maybe just been taken out of my sport or something like that, I think being able to come in as a clinician and show them kind of maybe a detailed, maybe a less detailed kind of roadmap of here's all the steps that we're going to do to get you back to where you ultimately want to go. It creates buy-in on their part. It also gives them a bit of self-efficacy to feel like, okay, I understand now that I have to complete X, Y, and Z to get to this here, or I have to do this, that, and the other to move on and through my rehab process. So I think it has a lot of value in that context as well. It forces you to be intentional with your rehab. It creates vision for the athlete. And I think in terms of like questions that I'm asking myself throughout the process, it probably starts with what does, ready actually mean for the athlete when they go back to their sport? What are the non-negotiable sort of demands that they're going to be exposed to? What ultimately do I want them to be able to do when we make the decision to go back? And what sort of boxes do I feel like need to be checked along that way? That's kind of how I start with that process. Is by the time they're back to doing whatever it is, it's returning to sport, what are sort of the things that I expect them to be able to handle? What sort of things do I need to make sure that they're physically prepared to be able to deal with? And then I think the other question would be what would fail first if we rushed it is also like a good question to kind of come back to, is as a bit of a maybe pause and think of like, what are the things that I'm maybe missing throughout this process? So I think that beginning with the end in mind and kind of reverse engineering your way back does a lot of good, from holding yourself accountable as the rehab provider or the coach or the clinician. It does a tremendous job at creating vision for the athlete, which kind of gets back to the idea of like trust, adherence, kind of driving your positive outcomes. And then I also just think that it helps you have the ability to kind of create some frameworks for yourself as you go along this process. So I think that it's done a lot of good for me just in terms of the cognitive load of rehab processes. And I think it's something that is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I think it's challenging to do. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, but it takes off some of the pressure once you build that out for the clinician and an understanding for the athlete or the patient like you're discussing. But it's so common for some of these long-term rehabs for athletes to ask, when can I start running? When can I go back to practice? When can I go back to sport? And if you don't have any idea of reflecting on those questions before that question comes about in real time, you're going to not probably have a coherent thought and a coherent actual plan and discussion and decision versus, well, I've thought through what you were saying, all the boxes that need to be checked. What are the non-negotiables? What are maybe the biggest limiters? And I can, to the best of my ability, kind of coherently outline this plan, or these are the steps that we need to make. These are the things that I would expect for you to hit along the way. And also acknowledging some of that uncertainty of, okay, I can't tell you if this is a month down the road or 3 months down the road or 6 months, but objectively, this is what I would want to be seeing. This is what I would want to be hearing from you. These are the things that together we would map out. And I think you've done a phenomenal job with that, just seeing you do it in practice. But it's challenging to do that as a young clinician, to think through those things, because you may feel paralyzed of, all right, they just tore their ACL, they're a week status post, and now I'm looking at a year-long timeline on average. I know they need to get back to soccer. This can feel overwhelming. So do you have any like words of wisdom for that younger clinician that is trying to follow through with these principles? If I know what the end goal is and I know where they're at right now, but I'm really struggling to figure out what that all looks like for the whole year or for this multi-month process, how do people have a little bit more of a digestible approach? Is it really just kind of taking it bit by bit and working their way through it? Or do you have any feedback or thoughts there?
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful things that I did for myself to organize my thoughts around potentially rehabs that I'm seeing a lot of, like let's take ACL for example, is I literally just sat down and went through like a 12-month kind of rehab, and I was, very not specific to start, but here are kind of maybe three main categories. Like, what are like the KPIs that I want to see at this first 2 months? What about from month 3 to 6, or 6 to 9, or 9 to 12? Just sit down and actually put your thoughts on paper around what do I want to see at X, Y, and Z to kind of earn the right to progress, or what are the hurdle requirements that I'm setting for this person to move on to this next phase of rehab or onto this next stage. And I think that just by doing that, one is going to bring clarity to your thought process, but it's also going to be incredibly powerful because you may realize like, oh shit, I have no idea what actually I am going to hold myself accountable to go from, when do they start integrating with their team or training integration or things like that. So I think that it's a self-reflective process that's going to have dividends for you in terms of clinical practice, but it's also going to potentially show you your blind spots around, okay, like I actually don't know when I'm going to hold people accountable at this point here. It's time for me to kind of maybe investigate or do a little bit of some work to kind of make this a little bit more clear there. So I think just by actually engaging in the process, sitting down and doing it, it doesn't need to be terribly complex. I've wasted hours crying over Google Sheets, working through a lot of those things, but just start simple. And I think it'll be a very informative process for you. Be very simple, establish a few KPIs that you're going to utilize to guide the rehab process. You can always make it better, more detailed. The act of doing it is probably powerful enough in and of itself.
Let's go to number 6. Evidence leads, experience interprets, and context decides. Can you elaborate on those 3?
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to get at or make sense of with that phrasing, evidence leads, experience interprets, context decides, is maybe this deeper concept or idea of like clinical judgment. And, judgment is really just this cognitive process of understanding, formulating opinions, and then ultimately making decisions or choices. And I think that's probably much more what we're really navigating as providers on a day-to-day basis. I don't think it's as simple or straightforward as sort of the David Sackett model of evidence-based practice, kind of like the three-legged stool concept. That has its own issues and flaws. But at the same time, I do think that there needs to be an element of all three at play, or this kind of coexisting that happens to be successful in clinical practice. And what I think we want to avoid, or the mistake we want to try to avoid, is over-indexing on one at the expense of the others. And what I feel like I see often is this process of almost utilizing clinical experience as a sort of shield, or in some instances, these very maybe nuanced or specific cases as a means to kind of discount or close off the mind from the body of evidence as a whole, which I think is misguided, because an over reliance on clinical experience or N of 1 cases has the potential to set you up to fall victim for like a number of logical fallacies. But at the same time, you have the individual that maybe doesn't have as much, or in some cases any clinical experience, that is maybe leaning too heavily on the research side of things and becoming overly rigid in clinical practice. And then maybe they're struggling to actually find success because they can't, or they won't fill the gaps between the evidence itself and the actual implementation in practice. So I'm not saying that one is better than the other or one is worse than the other. They each have their own shortcomings. And I think that to be successful in clinical practice, you need to be aware, or acutely aware, of the limitations of each, but also acutely aware of your own limitations and weak spots, and be willing to have a degree of flexibility in your execution that is based off the clinical context, which is often going to be dictated by the individual that you're working with. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think to add to that, it's having an idea of what research can do really well is to explain what are things that are with a lot of these papers that we've discussed with previous guests, like a consensus statement or a systematic review or a guideline consensus paper, something that maybe gives some structure. These are things that at this point we think are really valuable during this injury or this type of rehab. And you can use those to anchor yourself to understanding what is important. But then research doesn't do a great job providing granularity of person to person. How do I get those priorities across or established or checked off. And again, for a new clinician, that can feel scary because you may want a very clear path. But once you realize there's a lot of different paths, that can feel freeing, or hopefully feels freeing, because then to this post, the context decides that individual person can help with their specific goals, their resources, their availability, their kind of current status, and that shared decision. You can then map out a plan of, these are the things that we know are really big priority or the non-negotiables we have to hit. And the research suggests this relatively clearly. However, we have a lot of flexibility of how we go about that. And one that hopefully makes it more interesting for you as the clinician, because you're not following a cookie cutter protocol, and more salient to the patient because it's now adapted to their specific context and decision making, and they have more autonomy and influence as well. Yeah, so I really like this point number 6. Anything else with this that you want to touch on?
No, I think that summarizes things nicely. I think nothing is ever going to be perfect with the nature of kind of what we do, but I think that that's not an excuse to, throw away the research or something like that, or to necessarily, throw away clinical experience, because I think that it's really kind of the integration of them that is probably going to be conducive to you being successful. And like, that's not like some sort of, woo-woo, like we're balancing these things here, because I think ultimately the foundation of your practice needs to be driven by the evidence, but it's more of like the value of clinical maybe experience or accumulating clinical interactions is you're getting better at kind of understanding how can I take some of these concepts or ideas from the research or from the body of evidence, and what does that actually look like when it comes to putting them into practice? Because I think that there is a little bit of a gap or a bridge there that ultimately is probably this clinical judgment that we're talking about, that you need to have some degree of reps or experience to integrate successfully. And that's just part of the process. I think that that's something that we're all continuing to try to refine and improve as we go about clinical practice.
Let's go to number 7, data-driven, measure, monitor, modify / change. What do you mean there? And can you dive further?
Yeah, I think, we kind of talked about offline, like trying to assist in determining what's signal and what's noise, starting simple and what do I suggest there. It very much feels like we are kind of riding this wave in rehab right now of, tech is coming along with everything, like it's very much objective driven, which is great. Like it's something that I'm a huge proponent of. I love my technology. I use my ice kinetic dynamometer every day, use my force plates every day. But I think that we also need to be aware of some of the limitations that come with that as well. Not all data is useful information. And I think that if you don't know what you're going to do with a metric, don't bother collecting it is something that is pretty important. But I would also say that it's important to understand that the errors or the problems don't lie with the technology itself, right? The machine just does what it's supposed to do. The load cell monitors the load going across it. It gives you out a readout, et cetera, things like that. It's the human in the equation, the person that is conducting the test, capturing the data, interpreting the results, and ultimately making decisions off of that is where the error truly lies. So this kind of gets at the idea of the validity of validity of inference, which is really just kind of the idea of how sensible are the conclusions that you're drawing from the data that you're capturing. I think that's super important before we start to maybe get too lost in the weeds with data and metrics, is understand that the information is useful, but just because you're capturing the information doesn't necessarily mean that the decisions that you're making are necessarily valid and reliable. So I think I'm a huge proponent of objectifying the field of physical therapy. If that gets people to start testing their ACL patients' quads, great. It's incredibly valuable to serve as a pressure test of your programming. I think it holds you accountable as a clinician. If I have captured this data and then I've gone through a programming block because I'm going to try to improve said quality, the data is going to tell you whether or not you were successful in doing that. So I think it has a ton of value in that. I also think that it's always useful because it's a conversation starter with you and the athlete for a lot of reasons too. So I think that it serves a secondary benefit from that side of things as well, which is starting conversations around where you maybe are at in the rehab process and things like that. So I want to try to provide something actionable and not just pontificate and throw these like polysyllabic phrases out. So I think starting simple, the biggest thing that I would say to people is if you're starting to work with force plates or dynamometry or things of that nature, the majority of us are not practicing in a setting where we have the luxury of a sports scientist who's going to be responsible for test conduction and then data collection. So with that, I think that my first piece of advice would be spend time to really fine tune the standardization of your testing process and your data collection. I'm talking about everything from, the warm up preceding maybe your jump testing, how you're going to cue your jumps, all of these things that I think kind of get missed when we're maybe caught up in kind of the excitement of integrating the data itself. Because I'll have people that will, and this is something that at our facility where my big kind of project for 2026 is really trying to standardize a lot of this stuff. We get a lot of people and athletes that come through our facility for either return to sport testing or things of that nature. And I think that the data that you're capturing is only going to be as useful as the process that you actually conducted to execute it. So don't sleep on standardizing your data collection process. It'll likely make your inferences probably much more impactful if we are confident in the way we collected it. And then from there, I would say that as opposed to thinking about things as, I need to get data on a counter movement jump or a drop jump or whatever it is, I think it's more helpful to think of it as start with like the metric that you want to investigate first, because there's likely going to be a specific test or something along those lines that is going to be most useful for capturing that individual metric. So as opposed to thinking about it as distinct tests in and of themselves, think of it more from what metric do I want to capture. If the goal is kind of to understand like a force generating capacity, I'm going to use this test. If I'm looking to get insight on rate of force development or rate of torque development, maybe I'll use this one over here. If I want to explore or get a better understanding of someone's reactive strength, I'm going to go with kind of this maybe test here. So I think that thinking about things in a metric first fashion is probably going to be more useful for some of your thought process and data collection there as well. And then the last thing I would say in terms of just actionable advice would be utilize kind of the population that you're maybe interacting a lot with as your kind of decision making to build your test battery, because I think it'll give you a lot of reps with collecting the data. It's going to be specific to the population that you're actually working with, and it'll give you much more opportunities to maybe find the limitations or the shortcomings in your test conduction process, your data interpretation, and things like that. So I think in terms of actionable advice, I would say double down on your standardization, think about things with more of a metric first kind of process, and then utilize kind of your patient population to help you build out your sort of maybe testing battery that is going to hopefully have some influence on your practice and day-to-day.
Yeah, what I really appreciated about when we were working together and the other therapists in the facility of that standardization of testing with just the granular things that may not be seemingly that big of a deal, but that are a huge deal. Like you were talking about the amount of warm-up sets, the cueing, the comfortability of the setup, the amount of maximal effort tests, the rest in between, like all these things. If there's huge variability of one or a handful of those throughout a testing session over weeks and months, that doesn't give likely a ton of confidence that this is a reliable test or series of tests. So I can't touch on that enough. And then I think, before I left the facility, the Vault, the force plates, they were there for, I don't know, maybe 6 to 12 months. And at least at that point, a big emphasis that you had was just tinkering with the setup, the standardization, but also just the frequency in practicing it, and then getting athletes on it to kind of normalize it, and then to see trends over time, as opposed to, like you were kind of saying, I'm super excited about this piece of technology. I'm going to have them do counter movement jump, a drop jump, single leg counter movement jumps. And then I'm going to base all of my decision making off of this first ever test that this athlete's done and that I've interpreted. And something that I really respected about how you went about when that new technology came in of there just needs to be more exposure for the patient, for myself, an understanding of where are these flaws and how I can make it better. What are the trends for this specific individual? You're kind of lowering the stressful bar of if someone's kind of practicing it every single session, or you're kind of integrating it in, it also is less scary for them. And so, yeah, I really liked how with some of these maybe more finicky or more variable tests, like some of the counter movement jump, the drop jump, just the force plates as a whole, you trying to base your decision off of one round of testing. I think that's also really challenging. Can you kind of speak to the value in repetitive testing and accumulating information and making decisions based off of trends as opposed to these one-off tests?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's honestly one of the biggest things I would say I don't know if I would say changed, but maybe altered in my clinical practice is the role of embedded testing, to where it's just going to be part of our training session that day. I may throw in, a loaded counter movement jump as part of our maybe plyometric prescription or kind of velocity based stuff on that day. And it's just like collecting as many data points over and over and over and over and over again to, one, help me pick out trends, which kind of gets back to this idea of, your objective testing should be like a pressure test of your programming. Like, I'm building all of this stuff out. Like, I should hopefully see some sort of improvement in the metric that I'm after. But I also think that it gives you, maybe certainty is the wrong word, but it helps you feel better about the decisions you're making if I have 100 data points as opposed to 4 data points at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months or something like that, which I think still happens in rehab, to where it's like, I go to this site to be tested, I'm never there again. And it's like, I don't think that information is terribly useful when we really kind of step back and think about it. Like, I would much rather have a trend across the last 6, 8, 12 months to like see how their physical profile has changed or altered. And I think that it's more useful than just making yes or no decisions, because again, a lot of the stuff that we're doing with testing is still just determining like how much risk are you comfortable moving forward with, right? It's like there's a great like icon that I think about from Matt Jordan, where he's got poker chips in a bucket, to where it's like there's always going to be a poker chip that you pull out that has a risk in it. We're just dealing with the probabilities of like how likely is it that you're going to pull out that risky poker chip, right? So I think that the more data that you can collect, whether that be via embedded testing within your session or something along those lines, the more useful it's going to be from a programming standpoint, and also the more useful it's going to be from a decision-making standpoint with respect to your rehabilitation and how you're maybe planning to move forward with the individual in front of you. So I don't think I can really emphasize that enough, that you're going to need a lot of data points. And I think that, one, just from figuring out the technology itself, but 2, I think it makes you a more informed practitioner if you can accumulate that throughout the entirety of the rehab process, as opposed to a few distinct time points.
People may misinterpret more data as I just need more tests as a whole. How do you decide I want these collection of metrics that I deem valuable, without getting lost in, now I have a battery of 15 tests that I'm doing, or 20, or it's kind of this infinite number that just keeps being added, and clinicians struggle with the idea of being more simplistic and realizing these are the small handful of tests that are the most valuable, as opposed to, well, I need to gather as much data as possible, I'm going to do these 15 plus tests.
Yeah, I've definitely been there before. Like, I think that like there's at one point I had, I don't know, way too many tests that I was trying to capture data with across the rehab process. I think the way that, because again, like in many ways, if you think about it, like every training session with the individual is a test kind of in and of itself, right? I think that I'm very much a proponent of bringing technology to rehab and physical therapy process, but there's also merit to the idea of like a coach's eye and things of that nature too. I don't want to lose sight of that. But I think the way that I maybe think about it is, I want to have something that is going to, again, it depends on the population that you're dealing with, right? The surgery, things of that nature, but something that is going to capture like their peak force or their peak torque generating capabilities, something that is going to capture their rate of force or rate of torque development, and then things that are going to give me insight into their utilization of their, like maybe their stretch shortening cycle or something like that, right? Maybe something that is more explosive in nature, where we're thinking longer ground contact times or something like that, and then something that is more reactive in nature or shorter ground contact times. That's kind of the buckets that I have loosely in my head, and I think that that's going to be a very useful physical profile for you if you collect metrics or a couple tests that capture all those type of things. I think it'll help you build the profile for that individual really, really well, and give you information on, okay, I need to maybe prioritize more of X kind of in our programming moving forward because their peak force is lagging well behind, or something along those nature. So I think like be simple, but be diligent in the tests that you're selecting. More is not necessarily better. The ones that really are going to influence your programming and decision making are the ones that are worth your time.
Play maybe devil's advocate, the coach's eye that you discussed in the day-to-day clinical session. If you're having them, when it gets to the appropriate point, they're doing a variety of different play metrics. They're doing rate of force development, power-based, slower velocity, higher force. They're doing a spectrum of different movements. You're seeing how they're looking side to side, and you're tracking that over time. Is it common for you to see things that stand out with your testing that you weren't already aware of through the rehab process? One, kind of that's the first question. And then two, is the testing more so having a little bit more kind of objective tracking of those things that you're maybe already have an idea of? And then two, to your point, kind of that discussion and education piece to the patients as well, to kind of show them in a more formalized manner how much of this testing is really changing your decision making versus I kind of already had an idea that this is where this individual's at based on how the rehab has been going. Are there times where it really is, wow, I really need to spend more time focusing on whatever metrics you're tracking that are much more of a deficit than I was expecting?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've definitely had both, I would say. I'm much more in the camp of assume nothing, test everything, because I do think, particularly depending on the population that you're dealing with, people can hide very large deficits that you are maybe not aware of at all, or it's something that they've been managing for an extended period of time that you just kind of stumble upon, which again, that's kind of a different discussion than the one we're having here, because then the question becomes, well, they've been managing it with this for so long. Is it even worth acting on? Like, we'll put that kind of aside for now. But I would say that I think that it's still something that I prioritize because of the conversation piece of it, for sure. That's an element of it. If I have someone that is maybe very much itching or chomping at the bit to move on to X, Y, and Z, I do think that an objective test that shows me you're not close or you're not ready, this is why we're prioritizing some of these things, is helpful for a number of reasons. With respect to, am I already kind of thinking or anticipating a certain result based off of their progression in rehab? I do think that that's true, but there's also scenarios where that has not been the case. So I think that either way, if your rehab is progressing in a manner that is expected with what you maybe initially thought, the testing should really just be a confirmation of that. But I still think that it's worth doing because of the reasons we kind of chatted about a second ago, where you'd be very surprised sometimes that if you go through the entire process and you don't look at testing, how big of a gap you may find there. So I think that it serves multiple purposes. It's definitely something that, at least as part of my clinical practice, I'm going to continue to implement at a very frequent basis, simply because I don't see the downside of doing it.
Let's keep chipping away. Number 8, consistency is greater than perfection. Progress rewards consistency. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think this just kind of gets at the idea that we know that rehab is a nonlinear process. There's going to be periods where everything is kind of going your way and you feel like you're maybe ahead of the game. And then there's going to be instances where nothing's going your way, shit's hitting the fan, and you feel like you're behind in the process, quote unquote behind. And I think more times than not, neither of them are necessarily true, because it's really about the trajectory and the trend line of the entirety of the process. And I think that the people that are most successful in rehab are the ones that are able to maintain a relatively stable presentation, recognizing and understanding that there's going to be ebbs and flows. Potentially flare-ups are part of this process. And a lot of that's probably going to be contingent on you, the clinician, like laying that out for them, like we talked about earlier in this conversation with expectation setting. But as opposed to the person that maybe starts this process and everything is kind of going their way, they're executing things perfectly, and then they hit a flare up or whatever it may be, there's a sudden change in that. And now sort of the investment or things like that starts to tail off. I would much rather have the individual that is just kind of consistently showing up and like executing the process. They're bought into it, all those type of things. Maybe there's nothing that is perfect, so to speak, but it's consistently good. That's going to be much more conducive to getting across the finish line in the rehab process than the individual that is maybe executing perfectly for a certain period of time and then maybe just falls off completely. So I think it's all about kind of stacking little mini wins. We know that many of these rehabs that we're dealing with are very long processes, and it's simply just not realistic to expect that it's going to go perfectly. But if you can be consistently good and continue to show up and execute through the ups and downs and kind of ride the wave a little bit, I think you're going to be rewarded with progress and ultimately a successful rehab outcome.
I think that's really hard for people to do because it's hard for people to be consistent in a lot of areas of their life. And if it's someone that maybe doesn't have a background in structured exercise or movement or following more of a traditional outlined plan, that consistency is very challenging because it's a new habit essentially that they have to develop. And it is morphing that to figure out what is necessary or recommended for them. And maybe that consistency is, depending on this context, it's not a return to sport, but it's, I just want this person to be consistently walking 2 days a week. And you're setting the bar relatively low, but it's appropriately set for that specific individual. So I think there's also that perspective of this consistency doesn't have to be they're grinding every single day or doing 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 a days. It's, I need to meet this person where they're at. What are they currently doing? How can I kind of inch them further forward to expand my hopes for what they can achieve or their frequency over time? But that can look very, very different person to person.
100%. Yep. Well said.
Let's keep chipping away. Number 9, provide the map, let the athlete drive. You're the GPS, not the driver. This, I think, maybe kind of touches on some of the things you had mentioned in some of these previous principles, but what do you mean by providing the map, letting the athlete drive?
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of redundancy built in here kind of strategically, because I think that the principles like underlying them are super important, right? So I think when we're talking about kind of acting as a GPS as opposed to a driver, it gets at this idea where, my kind of role and my obligation is to be there as a guide through this process. You're the one that's going to be kind of ultimately behind the wheel. That's important because we still have some maybe malleability or adaptability in our process. Like I can take like a straight shot on an interstate to my destination, or I can kind of wind around, et cetera, things like that. And I think that the power in being the person that is the guide is that you still maintain a semblance of control, but it's not so maybe authoritarian where the athlete or the individual doesn't feel like they have any say in the process. I think that's a recipe for disaster relatively quickly. So the concept or the idea of being a GPS as opposed to the driver is like, here's kind of the framework or the process to get us there. What are your kind of preferences, things of that nature? And then they kind of have some autonomy throughout the process to dictate how we go about it there, as long as they're operating from like an informed position like we talked about today, and they have an understanding of maybe potential trade-offs, et cetera, things like that. It's trying to build an autonomous kind of process with restraint or kind of with restriction, and ultimately kind of getting at the idea of like self-efficacy, because in a lot of ways, I think as rehab providers, our ultimate goal is to kind of get the individual to not need us, right? Or at least that's the way that I look at it. And I think that there's certainly been scenarios in the past where I've maybe been too helpful, I guess, would be a way to think about it, or maybe too kind of rigid in my own kind of like programming philosophy with the individual. And I don't know that that was helpful either. So I think it's coming back to the idea that I'm going to be there to assist and to guide, to set guardrails, and to be a co-pilot, so to speak. But the athlete is the one that's ultimately going to be making the maybe lower level kind of like day-to-day decisions on how we get there.
I think that's 9 is a nice segue to the final principle, number 10. Be responsible to the athlete, not for the athlete. What do you mean?
Yeah, I think this is one that a lot of people can resonate with. I think it's one that I probably struggle the most with. And ironically, it's also the one that's probably the most important for longevity in the profession. So I think what I would say in an attempt to provide insight on the differences, I do think that you need to be invested and sometimes deeply invested in the process. I think that you have, as the provider, have an obligation there, but I think you can do that without being, or while still being emotionally responsible. And being responsible like to your athletes or your patient means that you're going to make good or follow through on the things that you said you would. You're taking ownership as the person that's going to guide, educate, monitor, and do your best to foster an environment that is going to be conducive to their success. With that, though, I think there needs to be an understanding that the athlete's also responsible, if not more responsible, for their recovery too. And I've certainly found myself in situations where I seem to care more about the process and the outcome than the individual. And I don't think that that's a healthy position to be in. So what I have attempted to maybe come around to is more so the idea, and I don't remember who or where I heard this, but I think it's fitting for the scenario we're talking about, is that I am going to kind of match your effort, not necessarily your potential. I think that's something that is important as the provider. So if the athlete is all in, like I'm going to be all in too. And if you're not, I'm still going to abide by my obligations and what I feel like is my responsibility, but I'm going to kind of match your investment. And I think that's something that is still an area where I'm trying to maybe grow in or get better at, because I do feel fairly invested in a lot of rehabs. And I think it's probably just maybe an element of my personality. I don't know if it's like necessarily good or bad, but I do think that having some boundaries is probably important, because there are a lot of things that maybe are outside of our control when it comes to outcomes that didn't go our way. That doesn't mean that we just throw our hands up and maybe check out completely. But I think that you owe it to yourself to have some degree of boundaries and still be kind of emotionally responsible. I guess that's kind of where I land on that one.
Yeah, you probably put in more work than any other clinician I've ever met on, I don't know if overextending yourself is the right way to put it, but deeply ingraining yourself into these athletes and these patients, which I think is very admirable, but I also acknowledge is very challenging to sustain in the long term, kind of what you're alluding to. And it's that fine balance. Like, if I were to ever be injured and I had to go through a long rehab, who would I want to be guiding my care? It's probably you, because I know how much input and education and knowledge and effort you're going to put into that rehab. But as the provider, that is super draining. And I've seen you go through it. And it is that balancing act of how do I provide the best quality care possible, the best guidance, but not be so deeply drained or attached to this person's outcomes, or whether or not they're following through with the plan, or whether or not they're going at the rate of progression that I would expect. And that, yeah, it's going to be different clinician to clinician and personality to personality. And I don't know if there is a right or wrong answer, but I appreciate you kind of acknowledging where you're at with it. And it probably will be an evolution for you, where you were at year 1 of, post-grad to year 5 to 2 decades in. That level of investment, I'm sure it will evolve for all of us.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully I'm not still doing this 2 decades from now, but just kidding.
Anything else with all of these 10 principles that you want to touch on or kind of finalize as we wrap things up?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of information, and I apologize if I got a little long-winded or I'm not maybe the most economical with my words sometimes, but I think that we covered a lot. Like I said, from the get-go, I appreciate you having me on. I hope that it was valuable for you, and I hope that the listeners get some value out of it as well. Nothing I think we have less to touch on.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop. Kevin, you're a freaking gem. I'm going to link your Instagram. Again, you don't post often, but I think people should just message you and find ways to contact you because you're great and have so much insight that more people should become friends with you and learn from you and discuss. Okay, we'll call it there. We're an hour in. I'll share kind of this 10 principles post so people can kind of look through it further. But I thought this was a super helpful discussion. Thank you for coming on, Kevin. We'll call it there.
Thank you.